You are no longer welcome in this house, and you will never see my children again." My daughter-in-law Cassandra screamed at me through the front door of what used to be my son's home in Millbrook Heights. I smiled calmly as I stood on the porch steps, my designer handbag clutched in my weathered hands. I had been waiting for this moment for 18 months. 3 weeks later, when she discovered I controlled the $4.2 million trust fund that would determine her children's entire future, she fainted right there in my attorney's office. What she said when she woke up changed everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm delighted you're here with me today. Please follow my story until the very end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my tale has reached across the world. My name is Delphine Ashworth, and at 68 years old, I thought I had witnessed every possible betrayal that family could inflict upon one another. I was catastrophically wrong. The words Cassandra hurled at me that crisp October afternoon in Millbrook Heights cut deeper than any surgeon's blade ever could, slicing through decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion I had poured into what I believed was an unbreakable family bond. I had been standing on the wraparound porch of the colonial home I had secretly purchased for my son Theodore and his wife 5 years earlier, watching through the bay window as my twin granddaughters, Juniper and Sage, played with the dollhouse I had gifted them for their 7th birthday just 2 weeks prior. The autumn leaves were dancing in the crisp air, painting the affluent neighborhood in shades of amber and crimson that reminded me of happier times when family gatherings meant warmth instead of warfare. Cassandra appeared in that doorway like a vengeful specter, her perfectly sculpted face twisted with a rage that seemed to emanate from somewhere dark and calculating deep within her soul. She had been drinking wine since lunch. I could smell the expensive Bordeaux on her breath from 3 feet away, the same vintage I had been providing for their dinner parties without their knowledge for the past 2 years. "I mean it this time, Delphine," she continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of finality that she had perfected over the course of our deteriorating relationship. "You are a toxic influence on Juniper and Sage, and I will not have you filling their innocent minds with your outdated values and manipulative behavior. This family has moved beyond needing your constant interference in our lives." The casual cruelty in her voice should have devastated me. For 18 months, I had endured her systematic campaign to erase me from my granddaughters' lives, watching helplessly as she scheduled activities during my planned visits, moved family celebrations to times when she knew I couldn't attend, and gradually poisoned my son against me with carefully crafted stories about my supposed overstepping and inappropriate grandmother behavior. But instead of the familiar sting of tears that had become my constant companion over the past 1.5 years, something entirely different washed over me like a warm tide of vindication. Relief. Pure crystalline relief that felt like the first deep breath after nearly drowning. After 18 months of careful observation, of deliberate financial testing, of allowing myself to be painted as the problematic mother-in-law who couldn't respect boundaries, I finally had the irrefutable confirmation I had been methodically collecting. I smiled, not the forced, diplomatic smile I had perfected during decades of navigating delicate family politics and social situations, but a genuine, knowing expression of satisfaction that originated from the deepest well of my being, the same place where I had been carefully cataloging every slight, every dismissive comment, every calculated move to distance me from the granddaughters who meant more to me than life itself. Through the pristine glass of their front window, I could see Theodore emerging from his home office, his laptop still balanced in his hands, that familiar expression of weary resignation etched across his features. He had inherited his father's strong jawline and my stubborn determination, but somewhere along the path of his marriage to Cassandra, he had lost the moral backbone that I had spent 34 years helping him develop. "Cassandra, what's all the shouting about?" he called out, though his tone suggested he already knew exactly what fresh family drama was unfolding on his front porch. "The neighbors are going to start complaining again." Of course, he would be more concerned about the neighbors' opinions than about his wife's public humiliation of his mother. This was the same man who had once defended me fiercely against schoolyard bullies, who had called me his hero when I worked 3 jobs to put him through law school after his father died, who had promised at his wedding that marriage would never change his love and respect for the woman who had sacrificed everything for his success. "I'm handling a family boundary issue," Cassandra replied, her voice taking on that sugary sweet tone she used when she wanted Theodore to believe she was being reasonable and measured. "Your mother needs to understand that our household operates according to our rules, not her expectations." What Cassandra didn't realize, what neither of them had any inkling of understanding, was that every word, every calculated manipulation, every deliberate act of exclusion had been meticulously documented and stored away in my memory. Not for revenge, though I won't pretend the thought hadn't crossed my mind during the darkest moments of my isolation, but for verification. I needed to know with absolute certainty who my son had become under Cassandra's influence, and what kind of woman was now shaping my granddaughter's understanding of family loyalty, respect, and unconditional love. The test had been running for 18 months, and today, with 10 simple words about my banishment from their lives, Cassandra had provided the final, damning piece of evidence I needed to proceed with the plan that would change our family's destiny forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone buzzed with a text message from my attorney, Harrison Whitmore, just as Cassandra slammed the door in my face with enough force to rattle the expensive stained glass panels I had personally selected during the home's renovation. "All documents prepared as requested. Trust restructuring complete. Are you ready to proceed with Phase 2? I typed back quickly, my fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Tomorrow morning. Schedule the family meeting for 10 a.m. sharp." It's time they learned the truth. As I walked down the cobblestone pathway toward my silver Mercedes, I caught a glimpse of Juniper's face pressed against her bedroom window, her small hand waving goodbye with the innocent persistence that only 7-year-olds possess. My heart clenched with a familiar ache that had become my constant companion since Cassandra began her systematic campaign to erase me from my granddaughters' lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being banished from a house I owned, dismissed by a woman whose children's entire future depended on my goodwill, and treated like a burdensome stranger by a son whose law firm partnership had been quietly funded by my investment portfolio. But that was exactly the point of the elaborate test I had been conducting for the past 18 months. I needed to know who my family really was when they believed I had no power, no leverage, and no options except to accept whatever crumbs of affection they chose to offer. The results had been more devastating than I could have ever imagined. My name is Delphine Marie Ashworth, and I suppose to most people, I look like exactly what Cassandra has spent months painting me as: a lonely widow whose husband left her comfortable but not wealthy, whose son tolerates her out of obligation, and whose greatest joy comes from those precious but increasingly rare moments with her granddaughters. What Cassandra doesn't know, what Theodore has somehow forgotten despite being the executor of his father's estate, is that comfortable doesn't begin to describe my actual financial situation. When my beloved husband Nathaniel passed away 3 years ago, he left me with more than just fond memories and a modest pension. He left me with the carefully accumulated wealth of 2 lifetimes of smart investments, successful business ventures, and an inheritance from my grandmother's textile fortune that we had never felt the need to flaunt.
The $4.2 million trust fund that Cassandra believes belongs to Theodore? That's just the beginning. What she doesn't realize is that I control not only that trust, but also the children's education funds, the college accounts, the property investments set aside for their futures, and the inheritance that would ensure Juniper and Sage never want for anything in their entire lives. More importantly, what neither Cassandra nor Theodore understands is that every penny of that wealth comes with conditions that I wrote personally, conditions that require the beneficiaries to maintain loving, respectful relationships with their family members, specifically with me. For 3 years since Nathaniel's death, I had watched my family's true nature slowly reveal itself. Theodore, who had once called me every Sunday without fail, began spacing his calls further apart until weeks would pass without a word. Cassandra, who had once invited me to every family gathering and holiday celebration, started finding reasons why my presence would be inconvenient or unnecessary. But it was the gradual erosion of my relationship with Juniper and Sage that cut the deepest. Suddenly, my planned visits conflicted with school activities. Family dinners were moved to restaurants too expensive for me to afford, or so they assumed. Birthday parties were scheduled during times when I couldn't attend, with apologies that felt more like formalities than genuine regret. The breaking point came 6 months ago when I arrived for Sage's dance recital, only to discover that Cassandra had told everyone I couldn't make it due to health issues. I sat in my car in the parking lot, watching through the community center windows as my granddaughter scanned the audience looking for me, her face falling when she couldn't find my familiar face in the crowd. That night, I made the decision to conduct what I privately called the family integrity test. I would allow them to believe I was financially dependent on Theodore's generosity, while carefully observing how they treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer except love and the inconvenience of aging family obligations. The test had been running for 18 months. Today, with her declaration that I would never see my granddaughters again, Cassandra had provided the final piece of evidence I needed. Tomorrow, she would discover that assumptions about power, money, and family loyalty could be catastrophically expensive mistakes. As I drove through the tree-lined streets of Millbrook Heights toward my modest apartment, the same apartment they believed was all I could afford, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation. Tomorrow, the performance would end, the masks would finally come off, and my family would discover exactly who they had been dismissing for the past year and a half. The game was about to change forever. The morning that changed everything forever began with what should have been a moment of pure joy. I had driven the 45 minutes from my apartment in downtown Riverside to Millbrook Heights, specifically to attend Juniper's school science fair, where she was presenting her project on butterfly migration patterns. She had called me herself 3 weeks earlier, her voice bubbling with excitement as she explained how she wanted to show me her display about monarch butterflies. "Grandma Delphine, you have to come see it. I made this whole chart about how they fly all the way to Mexico, just like you told me about your trip there with Grandpa Nathaniel. I put pictures of you both in my presentation because Mrs. Patterson said we should include family connections to our projects." That phone call had been the first time in months that one of my granddaughters had reached out to me directly, without their parents mediating the conversation or cutting it short with some urgent family obligation. I had marked the date in my calendar with a gold star and spent the following weeks helping Juniper research additional facts about monarch migration during our brief, supervised phone conversations. When I arrived at Willowbrook Elementary that Tuesday morning, carrying the professional poster boards I had secretly ordered to help enhance Juniper's display, I found myself face-to-face with a reception table staffed by 3 parent volunteers. One of them, a woman named Patricia Holloway, whose daughter was in Sage's class, looked up at me with barely concealed surprise. "Oh, Mrs. Ashworth," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of awkward uncertainty that people use when they're delivering unwelcome news. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion about today's event." I set down the poster boards and checked my watch. 9:30 in the morning, exactly 30 minutes before the science fair was scheduled to begin, just as Juniper had instructed me. "What kind of confusion?" I asked, though something cold was already beginning to settle in my stomach. Patricia exchanged glances with the other volunteers before pulling out a clipboard with what appeared to be a visitor restriction list. According to our records, Cassandra Ashworth submitted a formal request last week restricting access for certain family members during school events. Something about family dynamics that might be disruptive to the children's academic experience. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had been officially banned from my granddaughter's science fair by a woman who had somehow convinced the school administration that my presence would be harmful to Juniper's well-being. The sophistication of Cassandra's manipulation was breathtaking. She hadn't just prevented me from attending, she had created an official paper trail that painted me as a problematic family member who required institutional intervention. "I don't understand," I said, though I was beginning to understand all too clearly, Juniper specifically invited me. She's expecting me to see her project about the monarchs. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Ashworth, Patricia continued, her expression suggesting she genuinely felt uncomfortable with the situation. But we have to follow the family's wishes regarding visitor restrictions. Perhaps you could schedule a private viewing with Juniper's teacher at a different time. Through the hallway windows, I could see clusters of parents and grandparents making their way toward the gymnasium where the science fair displays were set up. Families laughing together, grandparents taking photos of their grandchildren's projects, multiple generations sharing in the pride of academic achievement. Everything I had been systematically excluded from for the past 18 months. That's when I saw Theodore walking through the main entrance, his expensive suit immaculate as always. His arm casually draped around Cassandra's shoulders as she chatted animatedly with another mother. They moved like a perfectly coordinated unit, the successful lawyer and his socially connected wife, attending their daughter's school event like any normal family. Except I wasn't considered part of that family anymore. I watched from the reception area as they made their way down the hallway, neither of them glancing in my direction, despite the fact that my silver Mercedes was clearly visible in the parking lot. This wasn't accidental oversight. This was deliberate exclusion, carefully orchestrated to ensure I would be humiliated in the most public way possible. Mrs. Ashworth? Patricia's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? You look pale. I realized I had been gripping the edge of the reception table hard enough to make my knuckles white. 18 months of careful observation and documentation had led to this moment. Standing in an elementary school hallway, being treated like a security threat by parent volunteers who had been fed carefully crafted lies about my character and behavior. But it was what happened next that provided the final, irrefutable proof of how completely Cassandra had poisoned my family against me. Juniper appeared at the far end of the hallway, her small face scanning the crowd of arriving family members with the focused intensity that children reserve for the most important moments in their young lives. She was wearing the butterfly pin I had given her for her birthday, and her hair was arranged in the special braids that she always requested when she wanted to look extra pretty for important occasions. When her eyes found mine, her entire face lit up with joy and relief. She broke away from her teacher's supervision and began running toward me, her project notebook clutched in her small hands, her voice carrying across the crowded hallway. Grandma Delphine, you came! I was so worried you forgot about my butterflies. I knelt down to catch her in my arms, feeling the warmth of her hug wash away months of accumulated hurt and frustration. This was what Cassandra was trying to destroy. This pure, uncomplicated love between a grandmother and her granddaughter. This connection that had nothing to do with money or social status or family politics, and everything to do with the simple human bond that transcends generations. But before Juniper could even begin to tell me about her project, Cassandra appeared like a dark storm cloud, her face flushed with anger and what looked suspiciously like panic. She grabbed Juniper's shoulder with enough force to make the child wince, and pulled her away from me with the protective urgency of someone removing a child from immediate danger. Juniper, what have I told you about talking to people without permission? She said, her voice sharp enough to make other families turn and stare. Mrs. Ashworth is not supposed to be here today. The confusion and hurt that crossed my granddaughter's face in that moment was devastating to witness. She looked back and forth between her mother and me, trying to understand why the grandmother she had specifically invited was suddenly being treated like a stranger who posed some kind of threat to her safety. But Mommy, I asked Grandma Delphine to come see my butterflies. She helped me with the research about Mexico. That was a mistake, honey, Cassandra said, her tone taking on that artificially sweet quality she used when she wanted to appear reasonable to observers. Grandma Delphine has some problems that make it hard for her to attend family events right now. We need to protect you from adult situations that might be confusing. The masterful cruelty of her approach was stunning. In front of a dozen other families, she had managed to paint me as mentally unstable, while positioning herself as the protective mother shielding her innocent child from a problematic relative. She had transformed my presence at a school science fair into evidence of my inappropriate behavior. That night, sitting in my modest apartment with the poster board still unopened in my car, I made the decision that would change our family's future forever. The 18-month test was complete. The results were conclusive. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of teaching Cassandra exactly how expensive it could be to underestimate the wrong grandmother. What Cassandra didn't know, what Theodore had somehow convinced himself to forget, and what would have changed everything about that humiliating scene at Willowbrook Elementary was that I wasn't just Delphine Ashworth, the inconvenient mother-in-law who needed to be managed and marginalized. I was Delphine Marie Rothwell Ashworth, sole heir to the Rothwell textile fortune, widow of tech entrepreneur Nathaniel Ashworth, and the woman who currently controlled approximately $47 million in diversified assets that would determine my granddaughter's entire futures. The modest apartment in downtown Riverside where I had been living for the past 18 months, I owned the entire building. The supposedly struggling widow who couldn't afford to contribute meaningfully to family gatherings, I had been quietly funding their lifestyle to the tune of $30,000 per month through carefully disguised channels that Theodore's accounting firm had been processing without his knowledge. Every mortgage payment on their Millbrook Heights colonial home came from a trust I had established in Theodore's name. Every payment on Cassandra's Range Rover, every private school tuition bill for Juniper and Sage, every family vacation to their beloved Martha's Vineyard estate, every designer outfit that Cassandra wore to her country club luncheons. All of it flowed from accounts that I controlled with the precision of a symphony conductor managing a complex musical arrangement. But the crown jewel of my financial architecture was something far more significant than their monthly expenses. The $4.2 million education trust fund that Cassandra believed would secure her daughter's futures was just one component of a much larger inheritance structure that I had been building for decades. Hidden within a labyrinth of legal documents that only my attorney Harrison Whitmore and I fully understood were additional trusts, property holdings, investment portfolios, and charitable foundations that would ultimately transfer over $20 million to Juniper and Sage when they reached their majority. $20 million. More than enough to ensure that my granddaughters could attend any university in the world, pursue any career path their hearts desired, travel extensively, purchase homes wherever they chose to live, and never experience a single moment of financial anxiety in their entire lives. More than enough to guarantee that they would have every opportunity that money could provide, assuming they maintained loving relationships with all members of their family. The key phrase being assuming they maintained loving relationships. Every single trust document, every investment account, every property deed contained ironclad conditions that I had spent 3 years crafting with Harrison's help. The beneficiaries could only access their inheritance if they demonstrated ongoing respect and affection for their grandmother, not visiting me regularly, not including me in family celebrations, not maintaining the kind of relationship that healthy families naturally cultivate. These behaviors would trigger automatic forfeiture clauses that would redirect the entire inheritance to the children's charities I supported. The best part was knowing that while Garrett was probably lying awake figuring out legal defense strategies, I would be sleeping peacefully in preparation for my first full day as a senior marketing executive whose expertise was valued, whose contributions were recognized, and whose professional judgment had been vindicated by the most comprehensive fraud investigation Seattle's marketing community had ever witnessed. 3 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Federal Building in downtown Seattle, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as news vans lined up outside like vultures circling a carcass. Today was the day federal prosecutors would announce the indictments that had grown out of what started as a simple billing dispute between Meridian Industries and a mid-sized marketing agency. The investigation had expanded far beyond anything we'd imagined during those initial meetings in Meridian's conference room. What Thomas had initially described as systematic fraud had evolved into a multi-agency investigation involving the FBI's white-collar crime unit, the Washington State Attorney General's office, and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Garrett's shell company scheme had triggered federal wire fraud charges, money laundering allegations, and tax evasion counts that could result in decades of prison time. But the most satisfying development wasn't the criminal charges. It was watching the complete collapse of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions as an ongoing business entity. The company that had systematically abused employees and defrauded clients for years had simply ceased to exist, not through dramatic bankruptcy proceedings, but through the quiet exodus of everyone who'd ever worked there. Janet Morrison had been the first to abandon ship. 2 weeks after our confrontation meeting, she'd submitted her resignation as interim CEO and immediately moved to Portland, where she'd taken a job with a nonprofit organization that apparently hadn't conducted thorough background checks. The Oregon State Bar was still investigating her employment law violations, but she'd managed to escape Seattle before the criminal charges materialized. David Fletcher had tried to reinvent himself as an independent marketing consultant, but his LinkedIn profile remained conspicuously empty of client testimonials or case studies. The nervous laugh that had once irritated me in meetings had apparently become a liability when trying to establish credibility with potential clients who'd heard about Pinnacle's implosion. Bryce Hamilton had disappeared entirely from the Seattle marketing scene. According to Marcus's investigative research, he'd moved to Phoenix and was working at a chain restaurant, while his legal team negotiated plea agreements for his role in the employee suppression conspiracy. The man who'd once used military metaphors to describe marketing campaigns was now learning that actual warfare involved consequences he'd never anticipated. The former Pinnacle office space on the 32nd floor of the Rainier Tower had been taken over by a sustainable energy consulting firm, a detail that felt like poetic justice, given how many renewable energy campaigns I'd developed while my contributions were systematically erased from recognition. But the most dramatic transformation had been in the Seattle marketing community itself. The Pinnacle investigation had triggered what industry publications were calling a, quote, transparency revolution, with agencies across the region implementing new billing accountability measures, employee recognition protocols, and client communication standards designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had defined Garrett's business model. Sarah Martinez had returned to Seattle and started her own agency, specializing in campaigns for companies that prioritized ethical business practices. She'd called me last week to discuss a potential collaboration between her firm and Meridian Industries, a conversation that would have been impossible when we were both trapped under Pinnacle's oppressive hierarchy. Kevin Thompson had been hired as a forensic consultant by the FBI, using his insider knowledge of corporate fraud schemes to help investigators identify similar patterns at other agencies. His wrongful termination lawsuit against Pinnacle had been settled for an undisclosed amount that his attorney described as, quote, life-changing. Lisa Park had joined a major nonprofit organization as their director of communications, where her strategic expertise was finally receiving the recognition it deserved. She'd sent me a handwritten note after the indictments were announced, saying simply, "Thank you for proving we weren't crazy." The story of how I came to possess such extraordinary wealth while living like a woman of modest means begins with my great-grandmother, Evangeline Rothwell, who built the largest textile manufacturing empire in the northeastern United States during the early 1900s. When she died in 1967, she left behind a fortune that had been carefully preserved and grown through 3 generations of women who understood that true wealth was meant to be protected, not flaunted. My grandmother Cordelia Rothwell had been the first woman to serve on the board of directors of Riverside National Bank. She taught me that money was a tool for creating opportunities and securing freedom, not for displaying status or buying social acceptance. "Wealth whispers, Delphine," she used to tell me during our Sunday afternoon tea sessions in her library overlooking the Connecticut River. "Only insecurity shouts." When I inherited the textile fortune at 25, after my grandmother's death, I was already married to Nathaniel and living what appeared to be a comfortable but unremarkable middle-class life in a modest colonial home in the suburbs. Nathaniel was building his software consulting business from our basement office, working 18-hour days and reinvesting every penny of profit back into the company. We drove used cars, shopped at discount stores, and saved every dollar we could spare. What our neighbors and friends never knew was that while Nathaniel struggled to build his technology company with borrowed money and maxed-out credit cards, I was quietly using my inheritance to purchase real estate across 3 states, invest in emerging technology stocks, and fund startup companies that my research suggested had exceptional growth potential. By the time Nathaniel's business finally became profitable enough to support us comfortably, I had already built a parallel financial empire that dwarfed his entrepreneurial success. The decision to keep my wealth hidden wasn't born from shame or deceit, but from wisdom passed down through generations of Rothwell women who had learned that money changed how people treated you in ways that were rarely genuine or healthy. My great-grandmother had watched friends and family members reveal their true characters when they discovered her fortune. Some became manipulative and demanding, others grew resentful and bitter, and a precious few remained authentic in their relationships with her. "Let people love you for who you are, not what you can provide," had been Cordelia's most important lesson. Then you'll know which relationships are worth preserving when circumstances change. So Nathaniel and I lived our entire 42-year marriage as if we were entirely dependent on his income. We celebrated his business milestones, worried together during economic downturns that threatened his company, and made family financial decisions based on his earnings alone. Even when his software firm was eventually acquired for $12 million, providing us with more money than most families could spend in several lifetimes, I never revealed that this windfall was actually a small fraction of the wealth I had been accumulating independently. This philosophy extended to how we raised Theodore. He grew up understanding the value of hard work, the importance of earning your own success, and the satisfaction that comes from achieving goals through personal effort rather than inherited advantage. When he expressed interest in attending law school, Nathaniel and I discussed the financial sacrifice required for his education, applied for student loans, and celebrated together when scholarships reduced his debt burden. What Theodore never knew was that I had already established education trust funds that could have paid for his law degree 20 times over. Instead, I allowed him to graduate with manageable student loan debt that he worked diligently to repay, building character and financial responsibility that inheritance could never provide. Only after he had established his own career and demonstrated his personal integrity did I begin quietly supporting his professional advancement through strategic business investments. The same careful approach guided my relationship with Cassandra from the moment Theodore introduced her during his final year of law school. She was beautiful, ambitious, and came from a family that placed enormous importance on social status and material displays of success. During our early conversations, she frequently mentioned her father's real estate investments, her mother's charity board positions, and her own expectations for the lifestyle that marriage to a successful lawyer would provide. I watched carefully as their relationship developed, noting how Cassandra's affection for Theodore seemed to intensify in direct proportion to his career prospects. When he received his first job offer at a prestigious downtown law firm, she began planning an elaborate wedding that would showcase their upward mobility to both families and their social circle. When he was promoted to senior associate, she started researching expensive neighborhoods where successful young couples typically purchased their first homes. Most troubling was how Cassandra talked about family relationships as strategic assets, rather than emotional bonds. She spoke about her own grandparents primarily in terms of inheritance expectations, and frequently made calculated comments about maintaining relationships with elderly relatives who might prove financially beneficial. During one particularly revealing conversation, she had mentioned that Theodore was fortunate to have only one living parent, since, quote, managing multiple elderly family members can become such a burden on young families trying to establish themselves. Even then, 3 years before Nathaniel's death, I had recognized the warning signs of someone who viewed family connections through a purely transactional lens. That I had hoped that marriage, motherhood, and the deeper responsibilities of adult life might help her develop more authentic emotional attachments to the people she claimed to love. When Juniper and Sage were born, I was cautiously optimistic that becoming a mother would awaken Cassandra's capacity for unconditional love. Watching her care for her newborn daughters, seeing her fierce protectiveness and genuine joy in their developmental milestones, I believed that parenthood might have transformed her into someone capable of loving family members without calculating the personal benefit. For the first few years of the girls' lives, this seemed to be true. Cassandra welcomed my involvement in their care, appreciated my babysitting during parents' evenings out, and seemed genuinely grateful for the emotional support that grandmothers naturally provide to young families. I spent countless hours rocking babies to sleep, changing diapers, preparing meals, and creating the kind of multi-generational family memories that I had treasured from my own childhood. But after Nathaniel's death, when Cassandra believed I had been left with limited financial resources and would need to depend on Theodore's generosity for my future security, her attitude toward me began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Invitations to family dinners became less frequent. My opinions about child-rearing matters were dismissed more quickly. My offers to help with babysitting or household tasks were declined with increasing regularity. Most painfully, I began to notice that Cassandra was deliberately scheduling family activities during times when she knew I couldn't participate, then explaining to the girls that Grandma Delphine was too busy to join them. Gradually, systematically, she was rewriting the narrative of my role in their family, from beloved grandmother to peripheral figure, whose presence was tolerated rather than treasured. That was when I made the decision to conduct the 18-month test that would ultimately determine how my vast fortune would be distributed among future generations. I needed to understand whether the family I had loved and supported for decades was capable of loving me in return when they believed I had nothing material to offer except my affection and my presence. The results had been more devastating than I could have imagined, but they had also been unambiguously clear, providing me with the documentation I needed to ensure that my wealth would ultimately benefit people who understood the true meaning of family loyalty. The decision to begin what I privately called Operation Family Truth was made on a rainy Thursday evening in March, exactly 18 months before Cassandra would ban me from seeing my granddaughters forever. I was sitting in my genuine modest apartment downtown, not the building I owned, but a simple 2-bedroom rental that I had chosen specifically for this experiment, when Theodore called to cancel our weekly dinner for the 3rd consecutive week. "Mom, I'm really sorry, but Cassandra has this charity committee meeting tonight, and we need to find someone to watch the girls," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of exhaustion that had become his default when discussing family scheduling conflicts. "Maybe we can try again next week." What he didn't say, but what I had begun to understand with crystal clarity, was that finding a babysitter for Juniper and Sage had somehow become more challenging than maintaining a relationship with his mother. Cassandra had gradually trained him to view my availability as less important than their social obligations, my feelings as less significant than her committee responsibilities. "Of course, darling," I had replied, maintaining the understanding tone that I had perfected over months of similar disappointments. "Family obligations come first." After ending the call, I sat in my deliberately modest living room, surrounded by the carefully curated evidence of my supposed financial limitations: discount furniture, generic groceries, outdated electronics, and made the decision that would reshape our family's future forever. If Theodore and Cassandra wanted to treat me like a financially dependent widow whose time and feelings were expendable, then I would give them the opportunity to fully explore what that relationship dynamic looked like over an extended period. The next morning, I called Harrison Whitmore and asked him to begin implementing the comprehensive testing protocol we had discussed hypothetically during several previous conversations. "I need to understand who my family really is when they believe I have nothing to offer except love and need," I told him. "And I need legal documentation of their choices that will hold up in court if inheritance challenges arise later." Harrison had been managing the Rothwell family finances for over 20 years, and he understood immediately what I was proposing. "Delphine, Are you certain you want to do this? Once you begin this kind of systematic observation, there's no going back to ignorance about their true character. You might discover things about Theodore and Cassandra that will permanently change your relationship with them. The relationship is already changing, I replied. The question is whether it's changing because of temporary stress and adjustment difficulties, or because they've revealed who they really are when circumstances aren't perfect. I need to know the difference. The testing protocol we developed was elaborate and methodical. First, Harrison would restructure my visible finances to create the appearance of a widow living on a modest fixed income. My luxury car was replaced with a 10-year-old sedan. My expensive clothing was donated to charity and replaced with outfits from department store clearance racks. My beautiful apartment overlooking the river was exchanged for the simple rental in a working-class neighborhood downtown. Simultaneously, all the financial support I had been providing to Theodore's family would continue flowing through carefully disguised channels that would be invisible to normal scrutiny but fully documented for legal purposes. Their mortgage payments, car loans, private school tuition, and household expenses would still be covered by my money, but they would believe these payments were coming from Theodore's salary, business loans, or other conventional sources. The psychological component of the test was more complex and required careful calibration. I needed to observe how they treated me when they believed I was financially vulnerable without actually becoming emotionally dependent on their approval or support. This meant maintaining my own emotional stability while allowing them to reveal their authentic attitudes toward elderly family members who required consideration rather than providing material benefits. During the first month of Operation Family Truth, the changes in their behavior were so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining the shift. Theodore's phone calls became slightly shorter and less frequent. Cassandra's invitations to family activities arrived with less advance notice and more apparent reluctance. My offers to help with childcare or household tasks were accepted less enthusiastically, and with more conditions about timing and duration. But by the third month, the pattern had become unmistakable. Family dinners were moved to restaurants that were supposedly too expensive for my budget, with apologetic explanations about how they didn't want me to feel uncomfortable about not being able to afford the cost. Holiday celebrations were scheduled around Cassandra's extended family obligations, with my attendance treated as a nice addition if it worked out, rather than a priority that influenced the planning. Most painfully, I began to notice changes in how Juniper and Sage interacted with me. Their spontaneous hugs became less frequent. Their excited chatter about school activities and playground friendships was gradually replaced by polite but distant conversations that felt more like interviews than natural family exchanges. Cassandra was teaching them, through countless small daily interactions, that their grandmother was now a peripheral figure in their lives rather than a central source of love and wisdom. The documentation process Harrison had established was meticulous. Every canceled dinner, every shortened phone call, every family celebration that happened without me was recorded in detailed logs that would later support the legal arguments for inheritance forfeiture, if that option became necessary. We tracked the frequency of their contact with me, the quality of our interactions, and the level of inclusion I experienced in family decision-making processes. More importantly, we documented the financial reality of their lifestyle compared to their supposed income sources. Every mortgage payment I covered, every private school tuition bill I satisfied, every family vacation I funded without acknowledgement, was cataloged as evidence of their willingness to accept my support, while simultaneously diminishing my emotional importance in their lives. By month 6, Cassandra had become bold enough to make subtle comments about the burden that elderly relatives could place on busy young families. It's so difficult when older family members don't understand that people have their own lives to live, she mentioned during one family gathering, clearly referencing my attempts to maintain regular contact with my granddaughters. Sometimes the kindest thing is to give everyone space to focus on their immediate responsibilities. The irony was exquisite. She was using my money to pay for the lifestyle that gave her the social confidence to dismiss me as irrelevant to her family's well-being. Every dollar I contributed to their financial security was funding their ability to treat me as a burden they had to manage, rather than a beloved family member they wanted to cherish. By month 12, I had accumulated enough evidence to support whatever legal action might eventually become necessary. But I also discovered something that surprised me. The longer the test continued, the more clearly I could see that Theodore was actively choosing to allow Cassandra's manipulation, rather than simply being passively influenced by it. When I tried to schedule individual time with Juniper and Sage, Theodore supported Cassandra's restrictions about appropriate boundaries and, quote, not confusing the children with too many authority figures. When I offered to contribute to family expenses within my supposed limited means, he accepted my contributions while allowing Cassandra to make comments about how some people needed to learn to manage their resources more effectively. He had become complicit in her systematic exclusion of me from meaningful family participation. This wasn't just a matter of a controlling wife manipulating a weak husband. This was a grown man actively choosing his social ambitions over his mother's emotional well-being. As the 18-month mark approached, I realized that Operation Family Truth had been devastatingly successful. I now knew exactly who my family members were when they believed I had nothing to offer except love and need. And armed with that knowledge, I was prepared to show them exactly how expensive their assumptions about power, money, and family loyalty were about to become. The cruelty escalated gradually, like a slow poison administered in carefully measured doses designed to avoid detection while ensuring maximum damage. What began as subtle scheduling conflicts and brief delays in returning phone calls evolved into a systematic campaign of emotional abuse disguised as reasonable boundary setting and family management. The first major escalation occurred during Sage's 8th birthday party, 6 months into my testing period. I had spent 3 weeks helping her design invitations featuring hand-drawn unicorns, her current obsession, and had secretly arranged for a professional face painter to attend the celebration as my gift to her special day. When I arrived at their house in Millbrook Heights carrying the elaborate unicorn cake I had ordered from the premium bakery downtown, I found the party already in full swing, with a completely different theme. "Oh, Delphine," Cassandra greeted me at the front door, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm so sorry, but we had to change the party theme at the last minute. Sage decided she wanted a princess party instead, and we already had everything coordinated with the new decorations. I hope you understand that children change their minds so quickly at this age." Through the living room windows, I could see Sage wearing an elaborate princess costume that must have cost several $100s, surrounded by decorations that clearly required weeks of planning and coordination. This wasn't a last-minute change of heart by an 8-year-old. This was a deliberate decision to exclude my contribution from her celebration, while making me appear foolish for misunderstanding the plans. But the most devastating part wasn't the wasted cake or the professional face painter I had to cancel. It was watching Sage's face when she saw the unicorn cake I had brought, her eyes lighting up with genuine excitement before Cassandra quickly redirected her attention to the princess-themed dessert table that had obviously been professionally catered. "Mommy, can we have both cakes?" Sage asked with the innocent logic of childhood. "Grandma Delphine's unicorn cake is so pretty." "Sweetie, we don't want to overwhelm our guests with too many dessert options," Cassandra replied smoothly. "Maybe Grandma Delphine can save her cake for another time when it's just family." Another time that would never come, of course. The unicorn cake that represented hours of collaboration between Sage and me was relegated to the kitchen counter, photographed politely by a few guests, and eventually thrown away after the party because we already have so much leftover princess cake. 2 months later, the pattern repeated with even more calculated cruelty during the family's annual 4th of July barbecue. I had volunteered to bring my famous potato salad, the recipe that had been requested at every family gathering for the past 20 years. When I arrived carrying the large serving bowl, one discovered that Cassandra had already prepared an upgraded version using organic ingredients and artisanal mayonnaise. "I hope you don't mind, Delphine," she announced to the assembled guests, "but I thought we'd try something a little more sophisticated this year. You know how younger palates are becoming more discerning about food quality." The implication was clear to everyone present. My contribution was outdated, insufficient, and embarrassing compared to the elevated standards that Cassandra maintained for her family's social gatherings. My potato salad sat untouched on the buffet table while guests complimented her innovative approach to traditional summer dishes. But Cassandra's masterpiece of manipulation came during the Christmas season, when she orchestrated my exclusion from the girls' holiday performance at their private school. Juniper had been selected to play Mary in the Nativity pageant, and Sage was singing in the angel chorus. They had been practicing their parts for weeks, excitedly calling me every few days to rehearse their lines and sing their songs over the phone. 3 days before the performance, Cassandra called to inform me that tickets were extremely limited this year due to quote 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 quote. Theodore would be attending with his camera, and she would be there to help with costume adjustments, but grandparents would need to wait for the video recording. "I'm sure you understand that we have to prioritize the people who are most involved in the girls' daily lives," she explained with that particular tone of regret that somehow managed to sound more like a lecture than an apology. The school really cracked down on attendance this year because some families were bringing too many extended relatives. That evening, I drove past the school during the performance and saw the parking lot filled with cars, the auditorium clearly not operating at any kind of reduced capacity. Through the large windows, I could see grandparents, aunts, uncles, and family friends filling every seat, celebrating their children's achievements with the joy and pride that marks these precious childhood milestones. I sat in my car watching families stream out of the building after the show, 3 generations laughing together as children still wearing angel wings and shepherd costumes chattered excitedly about their performances. That's when I realized that Cassandra hadn't just excluded me from a school event, she had stolen from Juniper and Sage one of those irreplaceable moments when grandparents beam with pride at their grandchildren's accomplishments. The financial irony of these exclusions was staggering. The private school where I was banned from attending my granddaughter's performance? I was funding their tuition to the tune of $28,000 per year. The elaborate birthday parties, where my contributions were dismissed as inadequate? I was paying for the mortgage on the house where they were hosted? The sophisticated holiday gatherings where my presence was deemed inappropriate? Every element of their upscale lifestyle was subsidized by the woman they were systematically humiliating. By month 15 of my testing period, Cassandra had grown bold enough to begin making direct comments about my limitations and shortcomings in front of the girls. During one family dinner, when I offered to help Juniper with her math homework, Cassandra interrupted with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's sweet of you to offer, Delphine, but Juniper is working with new math methods that are probably quite different from what you learned in school. We don't want to confuse her with outdated approaches." The message to Juniper was crystal clear. Your grandmother's knowledge is obsolete, her help is potentially harmful, and you should rely on younger, more educated family members for academic support. I watched my granddaughter's face as she absorbed this lesson about my irrelevance to her intellectual development. Even more painful were the subtle ways Cassandra began training the girls to dismiss my attempts at physical affection. When Sage climbed onto my lap during a family movie night, Cassandra gently redirected her to sit on the couch. "So everyone has enough space to be comfortable." When Juniper reached for my hand while we walked through the shopping mall, her mother suggested she was, quote, getting too old for hand-holding and should practice appropriate independence. Every hug was shortened, every spontaneous display of affection was redirected, every natural expression of the grandmother-granddaughter bond was gradually discouraged until my relationship with Juniper and Sage began to feel formal and constrained, rather than warm and loving. The most devastating escalation came during month 17, when I arrived for my scheduled weekly visit to find that Cassandra had enrolled both girls in additional after-school activities that conflicted with our traditional time together. Ballet lessons, tennis coaching, French tutoring. Suddenly their schedules were too packed to accommodate regular grandmother visits. I hope you understand that their education and development have to be our top priority, Cassandra explained as I stood in their foyer, watching through the window as other families enjoyed relaxed weekend time together. At their age, every moment counts for building the skills they'll need for their futures. The skills they were learning, I realized, included how to prioritize achievement over relationships, how to value productivity over family connection, and how to accept the gradual disappearance of people who loved them as a normal part of growing up. Standing in that foyer, listening to Cassandra explain why my presence was less important than tennis lessons funded by my money, I understood that the 18-month test had provided all the evidence I would ever need. Tomorrow, they would discover exactly how much their systematic cruelty was going to cost them. The night after Cassandra banned me from seeing my granddaughters forever, I sat in my modest apartment with 18 months of meticulously documented evidence spread across my dining room table, like a prosecutor preparing for the most important case of her career. Each canceled dinner, each excluded celebration, each dismissive comment had been recorded with timestamps, witness names, and photographic evidence that would make Harrison Whitmore's legal arguments absolutely bulletproof. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough to achieve the kind of comprehensive family restructuring that this situation demanded. What I needed was a strategic plan that would not only expose the truth about our family's financial dynamics, but also create lasting consequences that would protect Juniper and Sage from their mother's toxic influence for years to come. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed Harrison's private number, knowing he would be awake despite the late hour. For 20 years, he had been handling crisis management for wealthy families, and he understood that the most significant decisions were often made in the quiet hours when emotions had settled and clarity emerged. "Delphine," he answered on the second ring. "I've been expecting your call. I assume today's events have moved us to the implementation phase?" "Tomorrow morning," I confirmed, my voice steady with the kind of resolution that comes from absolute certainty. "I want the nuclear option, Harrison. Everything we discussed during our contingency planning sessions, full financial disclosure, complete trust restructuring, and immediate consequences for their behavior." There was a pause while Harrison processed the magnitude of what I was requesting. The nuclear option was a comprehensive legal strategy we had developed hypothetically, designed to completely reshape family power dynamics through carefully orchestrated financial revelations and inheritance restructuring. "Are you certain, Delphine? Once we trigger this level of intervention, there's no possibility of returning to the previous family dynamic. Your relationship with Theodore and Cassandra will be permanently altered, regardless of how they respond to the revelations." "The relationship is already destroyed," I replied, thinking about Juniper's confused face as her mother pulled her away from me at the school science fair. The question now is whether I can salvage something meaningful with my granddaughters before Cassandra completes her campaign to poison them against me entirely. Over the next 3 hours, Harrison and I refined the tactical approach that would maximize both the psychological impact and the legal effectiveness of tomorrow's confrontation. The timing, the setting, the sequence of revelations, and the specific consequences that would be imposed all required careful calibration to ensure that our objectives were achieved while maintaining the moral high ground that would be essential for long-term family healing. The first element of our strategy involved choosing the perfect location for the confrontation. Harrison's law office downtown provided the formal, intimidating atmosphere that would underscore the serious legal implications of the family meeting, while the conference room's recording capabilities would ensure that every word was documented for future reference. The mahogany table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling law books would create a setting that made it impossible for Theodore and Cassandra to dismiss this as merely a family disagreement. More importantly, requiring them to come to me rather than meeting in their home would immediately shift the power dynamic. They would be entering my territory, sitting in chairs I had selected, following an agenda I had designed. Every environmental factor would reinforce the message that I was no longer the supplicant in this relationship. The second component involved the precise sequence of financial revelations that would create maximum psychological impact. Rather than overwhelming them with numbers and legal documents immediately, we planned a gradual unveiling that would allow them to fully process each shocking discovery before moving to the next level of disclosure. Harrison would begin with the $4.2 million education trust that Cassandra already knew existed, confirming her understanding that this money was intended for Juniper and Sage's futures. Only after she had expressed her relief at accessing these funds would we reveal that this trust was merely the smallest component of a much larger inheritance structure. The revelation of my $47 million net worth would come next, followed immediately by evidence of how I had been secretly funding their entire lifestyle for the past 3 years. Bank records, property deeds, investment statements, and business partnership documents would be presented systematically, each piece of evidence building an irrefutable case that their comfortable life existed entirely because of my financial support. The psychological impact of learning that every mortgage payment, every private school tuition bill, every family vacation, and every luxury purchase had been subsidized by the woman they had been systematically humiliating would be devastating. But the real devastation would come when they understood that this support could be withdrawn immediately and permanently. The third element of our strategy focused on the specific consequences that would be implemented regardless of their response to the revelations. Harrison had spent weeks crafting legal documents that would restructure the trust conditions to include explicit behavioral requirements for the beneficiary's parents. Maintaining respectful relationships with grandparents, including them in family decisions, and ensuring regular, unsupervised access to grandchildren would become legal obligations rather than moral expectations. Failure to meet these requirements wouldn't just result in lost inheritance money. It would trigger immediate cessation of all financial support, including mortgage payments, school tuition, and business investments that made Theodore's law firm partnership possible. They would have 30 days to demonstrate meaningful behavioral changes, or they would lose everything that made their current lifestyle possible. But the most sophisticated aspect of our plan involved creating positive incentives alongside the negative consequences. Families who successfully rebuilt loving, inclusive relationships with their elderly members would receive additional financial benefits, including enhanced education funds for the children, property gifts, and business investment opportunities that could secure their financial futures permanently. The carrot and stick approach would give them clear choices. They could choose to restore genuine family relationships and receive unprecedented financial support, or they could continue their current behavior and lose everything that my money had made possible in their lives. The fourth component addressed the most delicate aspect of the entire strategy, protecting Juniper and Sage from the emotional trauma of their parents' financial and legal crisis, while ensuring they understood the importance of family loyalty and respect for their elders. Harrison had consulted with child psychologists about age-appropriate ways to explain inheritance conditions without making children feel responsible for their parents' behavior. We planned to present the trust restructuring as a positive development that would ensure the girls always had loving relationships with all their family members, rather than as punishment for their parents' mistakes. The focus would be on creating family stability and emotional security, rather than highlighting the conflicts that had made these legal interventions necessary. As dawn broke over downtown Riverside, Harrison and I completed our preparations for what would certainly be the most consequential family meeting in the Ashworth family's history. Legal documents were organized, financial statements were prepared, and recording equipment was tested to ensure that every moment of the confrontation would be preserved for future reference. My phone buzzed with a text message from Theodore. "Mom, Harrison called and said we need to meet about inheritance matters. Is everything okay? We'll be there at 10 a.m. as requested." The concern in his message was palpable. After 18 months of treating me like an inconvenient obligation, he was suddenly worried about inheritance matters that might affect his financial security. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. I typed back, "Everything will be fine, darling. We just need to have an honest conversation about our family's future." In 6 hours, Theodore and Cassandra would discover that their assumptions about power, money, and family loyalty had been not just wrong, but catastrophically expensive. And for the first time in 18 months, I would finally be able to tell them exactly what I thought about their treatment of the woman who had been secretly ensuring their financial security while they systematically destroyed her emotional well-being. The game was about to change forever. The morning of reckoning arrived with the kind of crisp November sunshine that made downtown Riverside's historic district look like a postcard. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrison Whitmore's corner office, watching Theodore's black BMW pull into the parking garage across the street, followed moments later by Cassandra's white Range Rover, both vehicles whose monthly payments I had been covering for the past 3 years without their knowledge. From my vantage point 30 floors above the street, I could see them emerge from their cars and walk toward the building entrance, their body language revealing everything I needed to know about their mental state. Theodore moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone who sensed approaching trouble but couldn't identify its source. Cassandra, on the other hand, walked with the confident stride of a woman who believed she was about to receive very good news about money that would soon be under her control. She had dressed for the occasion in her most expensive outfit, the Chanel suit she reserved for important social events, paired with the diamond earrings that Theodore had given her for their last anniversary. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawlessly applied, and her expression carried that particular look of pleased anticipation that she wore when discussing financial windfalls or inheritance prospects. Harrison appeared at my shoulder, carrying the thick manila folders that contained 18 months of documentation and the legal instruments that would reshape our family's future forever. "They're on their way up," he said quietly. "Are you ready for this, Delphine? Once we begin this process, there won't be any opportunity to change your mind about the consequences." I turned away from the window and smoothed my own carefully selected outfit, a navy blue dress that projected authority without ostentation, paired with the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother Cordelia. Every detail of my appearance had been chosen to communicate that this was a serious business meeting, not a casual family discussion about money matters. "I've been ready for this moment for 18 months, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. They've had every opportunity to demonstrate that they valued our family relationships more than their social ambitions. Today they'll discover exactly what their choices have cost them." The conference room had been prepared with the precision of a theatrical production. Financial documents were arranged in strategic stacks, each pile representing a different aspect of the fortune that Theodore and Cassandra had never suspected I possessed. Investment portfolios, real estate holdings, business partnership agreements, and trust fund documentation covered the massive mahogany table-like evidence in a courtroom proceeding. At the head of the table sat the crown jewel of our presentation, a leather portfolio containing the revised inheritance documents that would determine Juniper and Sage's financial futures based entirely on their parents' willingness to repair the family relationships they had spent months systematically destroying. Harrison's assistant announced their arrival over the intercom system, and I took my position at the far end of the conference table, where the morning sunlight streaming through the windows would create a natural spotlight effect while leaving Theodore and Cassandra slightly shadowed in their chairs. Even the seating arrangement had been designed to reinforce the power dynamic that would soon be revealed. When Theodore and Cassandra entered the conference room, their initial expressions reflected exactly what I had expected. Theodore looked genuinely concerned, his lawyer's instincts warning him that this formal setting suggested serious legal implications that might affect his family's security. Cassandra, however, practically glowed with anticipation, her eyes immediately scanning the financial documents spread across the table as if she were appraising merchandise at an exclusive auction. "Mom," Theodore said, moving to embrace me with the careful affection of someone who wasn't certain whether comfort or congratulations were appropriate for the occasion. Harrison said there were some urgent inheritance matters we needed to discuss. "Is everything all right with your health? Are there medical expenses we should know about?" The genuine concern in his voice almost broke my resolve. This was the son I remembered from his childhood, the young man who had once called me every day during his first semester of law school, because he missed our conversations about his cases and his future plans. For just a moment, I wondered whether the past 18 months had been an aberration caused by external pressures, rather than a revelation of his true character. But then Cassandra spoke, and her words reminded me exactly why this confrontation had become necessary. "Delphine, you look wonderful!" she exclaimed, settling into her chair with the confident posture of someone claiming her rightful place at an important negotiation. I have to admit, when Harrison called about inheritance discussions, I was hoping this might be about accessing the education trust for the girls. With private school tuition increasing every year and college costs becoming absolutely astronomical, we've been wondering whether it might be wise to begin some early financial planning. The casual entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. She was discussing my money as if it were already hers, making plans for assets she had never earned while sitting across from the woman she had banned from seeing her own granddaughters just 48 hours earlier. The disconnect between her treatment of me and her expectations about my financial support was so profound that it might have been comedic if it weren't so revealing of her fundamental character. Harrison cleared his throat and opened the first folder, his expression maintaining the professional neutrality that had made him one of the city's most respected estate attorneys. "Thank you both for coming today. We've asked you here to discuss some significant changes to the family's financial arrangements that Mrs. Ashworth has decided to implement." "Changes?" Theodore asked, his lawyer's training immediately focusing on the potential implications of that word. "What kind of changes?" "Mom, if you're having financial difficulties, or if there are health issues that require expensive treatments, you know we'll help however we can." The irony of his offer was perfect. He was volunteering to help support the woman who had been secretly funding his entire lifestyle, offering assistance to the person who had made his law firm partnership possible through her undisclosed investments. If the situation hadn't been so painful, I might have laughed at the complete reversal of our actual financial relationship. Cassandra, however, was focused on entirely different concerns. "When you say changes to financial arrangements, are you talking about modifications to the trust structures? Because I want to make sure that any adjustments don't inadvertently affect the girls' long-term security. Their educational opportunities have to remain our absolute priority."
She was worried about protecting money that she had no legal claim to, making demands about assets that belonged entirely to me, speaking as if she had some inherent right to control resources that I had accumulated through decades of careful planning and investment. The audacity was stunning, but it was also exactly the evidence I needed to justify what was about to happen. I looked at both of them sitting across from me, dressed in expensive clothes purchased with my money, driving cars financed by my investments, living in a house whose mortgage I had been paying for years, and discussing their concerns about accessing more of my wealth while simultaneously treating me like a burden they had to manage, rather than a beloved family member they wanted to cherish. This was the moment I had been preparing for since that rainy Thursday evening 18 months ago, when Theodore first canceled our dinner plans to accommodate Cassandra's social calendar. This was when they would finally understand that assumptions about power, entitlement, and family dynamics could be devastatingly expensive mistakes. Harrison reached for the second folder, and I felt the satisfying weight of absolute certainty settle over me like armor. The performance was about to end, the masks were finally coming off, and my family was about to discover exactly who had been holding all the cards in this game they thought they were winning. Actually, I said quietly, my voice cutting through their speculation with the calm authority of someone who is about to change everything forever. Before we discuss any changes to existing arrangements, I think it would be helpful if you understood what those current arrangements actually involve. The moment of truth had finally arrived. Harrison opened the first leather portfolio with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making the initial incision, and I watched Cassandra's face transform as the numbers on the financial statements became clear enough for her to read. Her expression shifted from confident anticipation to confused surprise, then to something approaching shock as she realized that the dollar amounts were far larger than anything she had imagined possible. This first document, Harrison began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had delivered life-changing news to wealthy families for over 2 decades, details Mrs. Ashworth's current liquid assets and investment portfolio. As you can see, her net worth substantially exceeds what either of you have previously understood. Theodore leaned forward to examine the documents, his lawyer's training immediately focusing on the legal implications of what he was seeing. Mom, these numbers. This says you have over $47 million in assets. That can't be right. Dad's business sold for $12 million, and we have been managing your expenses based on your fixed income from the pension and Social Security. The confusion in his voice was genuine and heartbreaking. For 3 years, he had been operating under the assumption that his mother was financially vulnerable and dependent on his support, making family decisions based on what he believed was his responsibility to care for an aging parent with limited resources. The discovery that I possessed wealth beyond anything he had ever imagined was shattering his entire understanding of our family's dynamics. Actually, Theodore, I said quietly, opening the second portfolio to reveal property deeds and real estate holdings. Your father's business sale was a relatively small component of our family's wealth. The Rothwell textile fortune that I inherited from my grandmother, combined with 50 years of careful investments in property acquisitions, created the financial foundation that has been supporting your family's lifestyle for much longer than you realize. Cassandra's hands were trembling as she reached for the real estate documents, her perfectly manicured fingers struggling to turn the pages as she discovered property holdings in 3 states, commercial real estate investments, and residential properties worth millions of dollars. But it was when she reached the deed to their Millbrook Heights home that her face went completely white. This says you own our house, she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet conference room. This deed has your name on it, dated 5 years ago. But we've been making mortgage payments. Theodore got the loan approved through his bank. We signed all the paperwork. Harrison smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master, revealing a particularly elegant strategy. Mrs. Ashworth purchased the property and arranged for a mortgage structure that would allow Theodore to make payments and build equity, while maintaining ownership herself. The monthly payments you've been making have been deposited into an account that Mrs. Ashworth controls, effectively meaning she has been paying your housing costs while allowing you to believe you are financially independent. The implications of this revelation hit Theodore like a physical blow. I watched him calculate backwards through years of mortgage payments, house maintenance expenses, and property improvements, realizing that every dollar he thought he had been investing in his family's security had actually been flowing back to his mother. His pride in homeownership, his sense of accomplishment in providing shelter for his family, his confidence in his financial planning abilities, all of it was built on an illusion that I had carefully constructed. But Cassandra's focus had shifted to an even more devastating discovery. She was staring at bank statements that showed regular transfers of $30,000 per month into accounts associated with Theodore's law firm, their private school, and their various family expenses. These transfers, she said, her voice rising with each word, these are going to our accounts, every month. For the past 3 years. Theodore, did you know about this? Did you know your mother has been paying our bills? Theodore's face had gone ashen as he examined the financial records, seeing for the first time the comprehensive support system that had made his comfortable lifestyle possible. Car payments, insurance premiums, school tuition, country club memberships, vacation expenses. Every aspect of their upper-middle-class existence had been subsidized by the woman sitting across from him. I don't understand, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. Mom, why would you hide this from us? Why would you let us think you were struggling financially while you were actually supporting our entire lifestyle? Why would you live in that modest apartment and drive that old car when you could afford anything you wanted? The pain in his question was genuine, and for a moment I felt the weight of the deception I had maintained for 18 months. But then I remembered Juniper's confused face at the science fair, Sage's disappointed expression when I missed her birthday party, and the systematic campaign of exclusion that had stolen precious grandmother moments from my life. Because I needed to know who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer except love and need, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I needed to understand whether your affection for me was genuine or conditional on what I could provide for your family. Harrison opened the third portfolio, revealing the documents that would deliver the final, devastating blow. These are the current trust structures that control the educational inheritance for Juniper and Sage. As you can see, the $4.2 million that you believed represented their complete inheritance is actually just the initial funding for accounts that will ultimately transfer over $20 million to each girl when they reach age 25. $20 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, representing security and opportunity beyond anything most families could imagine. But Harrison wasn't finished with his revelations. However, he continued, his tone taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings, these trust documents contain specific conditions that must be met for the inheritance to transfer to the beneficiaries. The primary condition requires that the children maintain loving, respectful relationships with all family members, particularly their grandmother, throughout their childhood and young adulthood. Cassandra's breathing had become rapid and shallow as the full implications of what she was hearing began to penetrate her consciousness. The woman she had been systematically excluding from family life, the grandmother she had banned from seeing her granddaughters, the supposed burden she had been managing and marginalizing, controlled not just millions of dollars in current assets, but also the entire financial future of her daughters. "What does that mean?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already understood exactly what it meant. "What kind of conditions? What happens if you continue to prevent Mrs. Ashworth from maintaining meaningful relationships with Juniper and Sage?" Harrison finished her question with clinical precision. "The inheritance is forfeited entirely. Every dollar goes to children's charities focused on grandparents' rights and family reconciliation services."
The silence that followed was profound and terrible. I watched both of them process the complete reversal of everything they had believed about power, money, and family dynamics. The woman they had treated as a financial dependent was actually their benefactor. The grandmother they had excluded from family decisions controlled their children's entire futures. The modest widow they had marginalized possessed the kind of wealth that could change generations. Theodore was the first to find his voice, though it sounded hollow and broken. "Mom, we never knew. If we had understood your situation, if we had realized what you were doing for our family, you would have treated me well for exactly the wrong reasons," I interrupted firmly. "You would have been kind to me because I was useful, not because I was family. You would have included me in family activities because you needed my money, not because you wanted my company." Cassandra suddenly stood up from her chair, swaying slightly as if the room had tilted around her. Her face had gone from white to green, and I could see beads of perspiration forming on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature of the conference room. "I think," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I think I'm going to be sick." And then, just as Harrison reached for the water pitcher on the credenza, Cassandra's eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed to the floor in a dead faint, her Chanel suit crumpling around her as she hit the carpet with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent room. The woman who had banned me from seeing my granddaughters had just discovered that her cruelty was going to cost her daughters $20 million each. Cassandra regained consciousness 7 minutes later to find herself lying on Harrison's leather couch with a cool compress on her forehead, while Theodore knelt beside her with the panicked expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Her first words, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper, revealed exactly what had been occupying her thoughts during those moments of unconsciousness. "The money," she said, struggling to sit up despite Theodore's gentle attempts to keep her lying down. "Delphine, the inheritance money for the girls. You can't really mean to take it away from them, They're innocent children. They don't deserve to be punished for adult disagreements. The fact that her first concern upon regaining consciousness was securing access to my wealth, rather than acknowledging the cruelty of her behavior toward me, provided the final confirmation I needed that our family's problems ran much deeper than simple misunderstandings or communication failures. Even faced with the complete destruction of her assumptions about our family's financial dynamics, she was still focused on what she could extract, rather than what she had destroyed. Harrison handed her a glass of water and returned to his position behind the conference table, where the final set of legal documents awaited presentation. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said formally, "we're not finished with today's discussion. There are immediate consequences that need to be implemented based on the current family situation." I remained seated at the head of the table, watching Theodore help his wife into a sitting position, while her eyes darted frantically between the financial documents still spread across the mahogany surface. The woman who had systematically excluded me from my granddaughters' lives was now calculating how much money her behavior had potentially cost her family, and I could see the desperate schemes already forming behind her eyes. "Delphine," Theodore said, his voice carrying a combination of guilt, fear, and what might have been the beginning of genuine understanding, "I need you to know that I had no idea about the extent of Cassandra's restrictions on your time with the girls. If I had realized how systematic it had become, I would have intervened." The attempt at distancing himself from his wife's behavior was both predictable and pathetic. For 18 months, he had been present for every canceled dinner, every excluded celebration, every dismissive comment about my role in our family. His claim of ignorance was either self-deception or outright dishonesty, and either option revealed a fundamental weakness of character that made him complicit in Cassandra's cruelty. "Theodore," I replied calmly, "you were in the car when Cassandra told the school administration that my presence would be disruptive to Juniper's academic experience. You sat at the dinner table when she explained to the girls that grandmother visits needed to be scheduled around more important family priorities. You signed the permission forms that excluded me from school events and social gatherings. Your ignorance was willful and convenient, not genuine." The accuracy of my observations hit him like physical blows, and I watched him realize that 18 months of careful documentation had created an irrefutable record of his complicity in marginalizing me. Every instance of passive acceptance, every moment when he had chosen silence over defending his mother, every decision to prioritize his wife's social ambitions over his family relationships had been witnessed and recorded. Harrison opened the final portfolio, revealing documents that would reshape their immediate future in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. "These are the new terms and conditions that will govern Mrs. Ashworth's financial support for your family, effective immediately. I need both of you to understand that these are not negotiations or suggestions. They are legal requirements that will determine your access to current funding, as well as future inheritance opportunities." Cassandra's face went white again as she realized that the revelation of my wealth was not the end of today's surprises, but merely the foundation for a complete restructuring of our family's power dynamics. "What kind of terms and conditions?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. "First," Harrison continued, reading from the legal documents with the measured precision of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news, "all current financial support for your family, including mortgage payments, school tuition, car payments, and monthly living expenses, will continue for exactly 30 days. During that period, you have the opportunity to demonstrate meaningful changes in your treatment of Mrs. Ashworth and her relationship with her granddaughters." Theodore was furiously scribbling notes on a legal pad, his lawyer's training automatically focused on understanding the specific requirements and potential loopholes in what was essentially a contract for family behavior. "What constitutes meaningful changes?" he asked. "What exactly are we required to do?" "Mrs. Ashworth will have unrestricted access to Juniper and Sage, including overnight visits, school events, and participation in all family celebrations," Harrison replied. "She will be consulted on all major decisions affecting the children's education, health care, and social development. Most importantly, Any attempt to poison the girls against their grandmother or to prevent them from expressing natural affection toward her will result in immediate forfeiture of all financial support. The comprehensive nature of these requirements was clearly overwhelming to both of them, but Cassandra's reaction revealed that she was already calculating ways to comply superficially while maintaining control over the underlying family dynamics. "And if we meet these requirements for 30 days?" she asked. "What happens then?" "If you successfully demonstrate that you can treat Mrs. Ashworth with the respect and inclusion that appropriate family relationships require," Harrison explained, "then the financial support will continue indefinitely, and the inheritance trusts will remain intact for Juniper and Sage. However, any future violations will result in immediate and permanent cessation of all benefits." But Harrison wasn't finished. He reached for a separate document that I knew would deliver the most devastating blow of all. "Additionally, there are immediate changes to your current living situation that reflect the new family dynamic. The Millbrook Heights property will remain Mrs. Ashworth's legal residence, but you will be welcome to continue living there as long as you maintain respectful family relationships." The implication was crystal clear. They were no longer homeowners, but guests in my house. Their sense of security and independence had been revealed as an illusion, and their continued residence in the home where they had been excluding me from family life was now contingent on their willingness to include me in exactly the way they had been refusing to do. Theodore's hands were shaking as he processed the complete reversal of what he had believed about his family's circumstances. "Mom, this is a lot to absorb. I understand that we've made mistakes, serious mistakes in how we've handled family relationships. But essentially holding our housing and our children's futures hostage to force behavioral changes is exactly what Cassandra has been doing to me for 18 months, I interrupted firmly. She held my access to my granddaughters hostage to force me to accept diminished status in this family. She used my love for Juniper and Sage as a weapon to ensure my compliance with her social ambitions. The only difference is that my leverage is financial rather than emotional." Cassandra suddenly found her voice, and when she spoke, the mask of polite civility that she had maintained throughout our relationship finally slipped completely. "This is blackmail," she said, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. "You're using money to force us to pretend to love you. You're bribing us to include you in our lives. That's not genuine family affection. That's financial coercion." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, revealing exactly what Cassandra thought about family relationships and the motivations behind human affection. In her worldview, love was something that could be faked convincingly enough to secure financial benefits, and she couldn't conceive of genuine emotional connections that existed independently of material considerations. "No, Cassandra," I replied with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 18 months preparing for exactly this moment. "This is consequences. For 18 months, you used emotional manipulation and social exclusion to control my relationship with my granddaughters. You taught them that love was conditional on convenience, that family loyalty was optional, and that elderly relatives were burdens to be managed rather than treasures to be cherished." I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where ordinary families were going about their daily lives, most of them completely unaware that love and respect were supposed to be the foundation of family relationships, rather than commodities to be rationed and withheld. "Now you have 30 days to teach them the opposite lesson," I continued. "You have 30 days to show Juniper and Sage that family members support each other through difficulties, that grandparents are valued for their wisdom and love, and that excluding people from family life has serious consequences that affect everyone." When I turned back to face them, both Theodore and Cassandra were staring at me with expressions that suggested they were seeing me clearly for the first time in years. The modest widow who had accepted their dismissive treatment with quiet resignation was gone, replaced by a woman who controlled their present circumstances and their children's futures with the absolute authority that only genuine power could provide. "The choice is yours," I said simply. You can choose to rebuild authentic family relationships and secure your daughter's financial futures. Or you can continue prioritizing your social image over family loyalty and lose everything that my money has made possible in your lives. Either way, the performance ends today. 6 months later, I sat in the sunroom of what had always been my house in Millbrook Heights, watching Juniper and Sage tend to the butterfly garden we had planted together in the backyard. The transformation in our family dynamics had been nothing short of miraculous, though I suspected the miracle had less to do with genuine character growth and more to do with the sobering reality of $40 million in inheritance money hanging in the balance. The first 2 weeks after our confrontation in Harrison's office had been awkward and stilted, with both Theodore and Cassandra approaching our rebuilt relationship like actors following a carefully rehearsed script. Every family dinner felt orchestrated, every inclusion in decision-making seemed calculated, and every display of affection toward me carried the unmistakable odor of financial desperation disguised as family love. But children, thankfully, are remarkably resilient and adaptable creatures. Once the artificial barriers to our relationship were removed, Juniper and Sage had embraced my renewed presence in their lives with the uncomplicated joy that makes grandparent relationships so precious. Within 3 weeks, they were spending every Wednesday evening and alternating weekends with me, sharing stories about school, friends, and dreams that I had been systematically excluded from for 18 months. Grandma Delphine, Sage called out from the garden where she was carefully watering the milkweed plants that would attract monarch butterflies later in the summer. The science teacher said our butterfly garden project is going to be featured in the school newsletter. Can you come to the presentation next month? I wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart, I replied, savoring the simple pleasure of being included in my granddaughter's academic achievements without having to navigate Cassandra's elaborate system of family access restrictions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Cassandra now went out of her way to ensure I was informed about every school event, every social gathering, and every milestone in the girls' lives. The woman who had once banned me from a science fair now sent me weekly calendars of family activities with personal invitations to attend each event. The transformation was so complete that other parents at the school had begun commenting on what a close-knit, multi-generational family we appeared to be. Theodore appeared in the doorway of the sunroom, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had spent 6 months learning to navigate a completely redefined family hierarchy. "Mom," he said, settling into the chair across from mine, "Cassandra wanted me to ask if you'd be interested in joining her committee for the spring charity gala. Apparently, they could use someone with your financial expertise for the fundraising strategy." The request was both amusing and revealing. 6 months ago, Cassandra had considered my presence at social events to be an embarrassment that required careful management. Now she was actively recruiting me for high-profile charity work, where my newly revealed wealth could enhance her social standing in the community. The complete reversal of her attitude toward my public presence was so transparent that it might have been insulting if it weren't so strategically useful. "Tell Cassandra I'd be delighted to help," I replied, though we both understood that my participation would come with the same oversight and documentation that had governed all our family interactions since the 30-day trial period had ended successfully. "I assume she'll want to discuss the budget allocations and donor cultivation strategies?" Theodore nodded, and I could see him processing the implicit reminder that my involvement in community activities would necessarily include the kind of financial influence that Cassandra had spent years trying to hide from her social circle. The modest widow who had once been excluded from family gatherings was now a wealthy philanthropist whose support could make or break charity fundraising efforts. But the most significant change in our family dynamic wasn't visible in public settings or formal family meetings. It was evident in the quiet moments when Juniper climbed onto my lap to read her favorite books, when Sage asked for help with her homework without her mother redirecting her to more appropriate sources of academic support, and when both girls included me in their bedtime prayers as someone who loved them unconditionally, rather than someone who tolerated them as an obligation. "Grandma," Juniper had asked me just last week, "why did Mommy used to say you were too busy to come to my school activities? You never seemed too busy when I called you." The question had required careful navigation, since my goal was to rebuild family relationships rather than to poison the girls against their mother by revealing the extent of Cassandra's systematic manipulation. "Sometimes adults make mistakes about what's most important," I had replied. "The important thing is that we're together now, and we're going to make sure that doesn't happen again." Harrison visited every month to review the family compliance reports and ensure that the behavioral requirements outlined in our legal agreements were being met consistently. These sessions had become routine formalities, since both Theodore and Cassandra understood that any violation of our family relationship protocols would result in immediate financial consequences that they could no longer afford to risk. Their lifestyle had become entirely dependent on my continued support, and they had learned to navigate our family interactions with the careful attention to detail that people reserve for protecting their most valuable assets. Whether their newfound respect for me was genuine or purely financial didn't particularly matter to me anymore. What mattered was that Juniper and Sage were growing up in an environment where family loyalty was valued, where elderly relatives were treated with dignity, and where love was expressed through consistent actions rather than conditional convenience. The real victory wasn't the money or the legal control or even the complete reversal of family power dynamics. The real victory was watching my granddaughters learn that family relationships required effort, respect, and mutual consideration to maintain. They were absorbing lessons about the importance of including loved ones in celebrations, the value of seeking advice from experienced family members, and the satisfaction that comes from nurturing relationships across generations. "You know," Theodore said, interrupting my thoughts as we watched the girls chase butterflies through the garden, "I've been thinking about what you said 6 months ago, about how we would have treated you well for the wrong reasons if we had known about your wealth from the beginning." I turned to study his face, curious about where this conversation was heading. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "I think you were right," he admitted, his voice carrying a weight of genuine reflection that I hadn't heard from him in years. "We probably would have included you in our lives because we needed your money, not because we valued your presence. But now, I don't know. Watching the girls with you, seeing how much happier they are when they know you're part of their daily lives, rather than just an occasional visitor, I think we've learned something important about what family actually means." The admission was closer to a genuine apology than anything I had received during the past 6 months, and I felt a small spark of hope that our relationship might eventually evolve beyond legal compliance into something resembling authentic affection. "Family means showing up," I replied simply. "Not just for the celebrations and the easy moments, but for the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the weekend science projects and the bedtime stories that nobody else will remember, but that build the foundation of love between generations." As the afternoon sun began to set behind the oak trees that bordered our property, I felt a deep satisfaction settle over me like a warm blanket. The 18-month test had revealed painful truths about my family's character, but the 6 months of reconstruction had proven that people could learn to choose love over convenience when the consequences of their choices were made sufficiently clear. Juniper and Sage would inherit $40 million when they turned 25, but more importantly, they would inherit the knowledge that family relationships required constant nurturing, that respect for elders was a non-negotiable value, and that love was demonstrated through actions rather than expressed through words alone. The performance was truly over. The masks had been permanently removed, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, on my own terms, surrounded by family members who had learned that taking grandmother's love for granted was a luxury they could no longer afford. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. Have you ever been underestimated by family members who thought they knew your true worth? What would you do if you discovered relatives were treating you poorly while secretly depending on your support? Comment below and let me know what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached across the world. And if this story resonated with you, I have 2 other family drama stories that will definitely surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.